Hi, I'm Ian Trevethan, Education and Outreach Director here at the Sternberg Museum of Natural History, and this is A New Way to Museum. Today, we're going to talk about Kansas state fossils. Most states have their own fossils, but not many states have two fossils. Kansas does. So we're going to talk about our two state fossils today. So if you look behind me, there's a large critter, skeleton of a large critter. This is a mosasaur called Tylosaurus. And Tylosaur is the first Kansas state fossil that we'll talk about. Now, Tylosaurs were a larger bodied mosasaur. They got up to be about 40 feet long. They were one of the dominant predators in the Western Interior Seaway that was over Kansas about 80 million years ago. So if you look, this animal has very interesting features. He's got a mouthful of sharp teeth, and which you can't see in this mount, but take my word for it, he's actually got a second set of teeth up on the roof of his mouth. So this animal is well equipped for processing whatever kind of seafood it's able to get its jaws on. And if you look, it's got this long, almost, some people might describe it as snake-like body. And that's actually how it would move through the water, is it would use what we call an ungulatory swimming style, which is a fancy word for saying back and forth motion. So mosasaurs would swim through the ocean in a very serpent-like manner or snake-like manner. So if you look at its arms and legs, you'll notice that it doesn't have a lot of shoulder bones. There was probably some cartilage that held everything together, but if you look at the skeleton here, you'll notice that its arm or its flipper, or however you want to describe it, doesn't have a lot of suspension there. And that's because it wasn't actively using its flippers to swim. It was more likely using its flippers to help it steer and slow down and that kind of thing. So it didn't need a whole lot of a shoulder girdle, is what we call that structure. So that's a unique thing about mosasaurs. We actually have some fossils that show pieces of the cartilage that held the shoulder pieces together. And the same thing goes for the hips. As you go further down the back of the mosasaur, the hips are sort of a similar thing. You don't have a huge pelvic girdle. It was a lot of cartilage that held it together. And again, that's because it's using both its front and back flippers to steer and to maintain speed or slow itself down as it swam through the seaway. So if you imagine when this animal was cruising, it would probably tuck its arms and legs against its body, very similar to what a monitor lizard would do when a monitor lizard swims. That's actually one of the things I use here in the museum to describe how this animal might have moved through the water when it was cruising. And then as it wanted to slow down, it would probably put its arms and legs out and slow itself down that way. These animals, like I said, were apex predators. We have fossil evidence that mosasaurs, and Tylosaurs specifically, would pretty much eat anything they could get their mouths on. We have evidence that they could eat fish, turtles, ammonites, other mosasaurs, anything that sharks, anything that they could get their hands on, or their teeth on, not so much their hands, they would be able to eat. So again, this is something that you want to avoid if you get a time machine and you end up back in the Cretaceous Seaway. So I will sort of step back and let you check out the mosasaur. As I said, mosasaurs were tail swimmers. They didn't use their arms and legs. So if you look at its tail is almost equal to the rest of the length of its body. And that's because it was a tail swimmer rather than a flipper swimmer. So you get this, the skeleton is it's very what I would call serpent-like almost. Some ribs, a big backbone, and then you've got your arms and legs for, as I said, slowing down and steering. The other interesting things about these animals is that they are air breathers. So just like modern day reptiles, these animals eventually had to go up to the surface to breathe air. but we think that they were able to actually hold their breath for quite a long time, and we think they had a unique physiology that sort of helped them adapt to the sort of the changing temperatures in the different kinds of waters that they might migrate through. So mosasaurs are a really, really interesting dynamic animal and represents our state very well, because I think Kansas is a very dynamic state. So let's talk about our second state fossil, which is an animal called a pteranodon. Now, a pteranodon belongs to a group of animals called pterosaurs, which are flying reptiles. Now, these flying reptiles are not to be confused with birds or feathered dinosaurs. They're distantly related to dinosaurs, but they're not the same thing. Pterosaurs are their own group of animals, and they were the first flying vertebrates that we know of that used sort of what we would sort of consider semi-powered flight anyways. So pteranodon is, I would say, a medium to large size pterosaur. And one of the most striking things about pteranodon is they possess a large crest on the top of their heads. One is called Pteranodon sternbergi, which has a very unique crest shape. I always say it sort of looks like Elvis. And a lot of people ask, what are these big structures on the tops of their heads? Well, one idea is that may be a way to, sort of attract mates. It might be for, display. So it might be slightly larger size than that of a female, or while the animal was alive, it might be brightly colored to signal its fitness. So that's one idea. The other idea might be something like what we call species recognition. When you've got a group of similar animals living together or in close proximity, it's helpful if you have structures that help you identify similar species. So species recognition might be one explanation. So that sort of explains some of the crazy structures, but some of these pterosaurs, and specifically pteranodons, are pretty large animals, about the size of a hang glider. So how did these animals get off the ground? Well, the answer is they had very, very light, thin bones. And we've recently discovered that the covering of the bone is actually paper thin. If you imagine this is a cross section of the bone, so this is your bone shaft, and then they actually had a very spoke-like interior of the bone that gave it structure. So it was an incredibly strong but very lightweight skeleton. And that's how we think they were able to be sort of lighter than air, so to speak. We do have some evidence that these were quadrupedal animals. That means they walked on all fours. They might have looked actually like sort of like a fictional animal, I would imagine, on stilts, using sort of their front limbs almost as stilts and their smaller back limbs to walk across the land. And we actually have evidence of this from trackways in different parts of the world that demonstrate that they were actually walking on all fours. Another big question is, how did these animals get into the air? And there are a couple of different ideas. For a long time, people just imagined they would sort of jump off a cliff or a rise to catch a thermal, and then they could glide from there. But how often do you come across a cliff that you can easily access to jump off and fly off of? So there are some other ideas out there that maybe they had sort of almost a slingshot technique where they could get up enough speed and sort of slingshot themselves into the air and sort of catch the thermal from there. But it's a hard thing to imagine, and it's difficult because we can't observe these animals flying. As far as what they would have looked like, we think that they might have had something like a feather-like structure. There are some fossils out there that show evidence that there are feather or hair-like structures that might have covered them. But again, we're still gathering information there, so that's not a definite. The other really interesting thing that we learn from pterosaurs, and more specifically pteranodons, is we can actually tell age by the texture of bone. We can tell juvenile from older adults. We can also tell male from female based on different shape and size of skeletal structure. So if you look at the pelvic structure of a female, it's actually got a larger opening, and that's for the purpose of pushing eggs through there. So lots of good information comes from fossils of Pteranodon and more generally pterosaurs. So that's all I've got for you today. Again, my name is Ian, and thank you for joining us with A New Way to Museum.
Thanks for joining us in A New Way to Museum with the Sternberg Museum of Natural History. If you enjoyed this video, like it and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell for notifications when we release a new video. Support us on Patreon for early access and exclusive content. You can also follow us on all our social media. Links are found in the description. Thanks for watching, and follow your curiosity to new discoveries.